The United States was founded on the idea of migration, originally from millions of Native American groups moving south following animal herds, but then by many other European groups such as Spanish, English, French, Dutch, Germans, and many, many others. After the writings in the Constitution and post-Revolutionary War, it was simple to define American citizenship on paper, but that wasn't the case in real life, especially when it came to immigration. During the 18th and 19th century, being an American citizen was narrowed. It was narrowed in a sense that if you didn't meet certain requirements, you didn't receive full American rights, such as being a white male property owner. The government did in fact swoop in to save the day at some points, but most of the time they simply had better things to do than help the minorities. A few of the groups that we will be talking about that were on the receiving end of this discrimination had included the Chinese, the Irish, and the Germans. Many of the Chinese had entered the United States through California during the gold rush in 1850 to 1925. Most of them entered through San Francisco, which soon they built a little ethnic enclave called Little Shanghai. Upon their arrival to the United States, the Chinese were harshly discriminated against because of how different their culture was. Many newspapers would print out comics, often defending the Chinese by making fun of their customs, how they looked, and how they spoke. Small things such as these weren't necessarily harmful, but they were offensive. Discrimination came at a larger scale when in 1852, California began implementing anti-Chinese legislation. Some of those included a foreign miner's tax, which was a $3 monthly fee for ineligible citizens, although it was mostly targeted towards Chinese working in mines. In 1863, Chinese were disallowed to testify in court, and their children were excluded from public schools. Later, in 1878, Chinese individuals were barred from owning real estate. Now, to top all of these off, along with many other anti-Chinese legislation, the United States passed the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which prohibited all immigration of Chinese laborers. In a Harper Weekly cartoon, there was a Native American and a Chinese man conversating on one page after the Exclusion Act, stating that the Chinese had inflicted fear on the whites, just as the natives did. This fear, in fact, was inflicted into white workers as well. Many white miners and other workers were feeling threatened by the presence of so many Chinese immigrants, especially in 1885 when Union Pacific workers were striking for better working conditions, and the company brought in Chinese strikebreakers. So white miners attacked Chinatown in Rock Springs, Wyoming, killing 28, wounding 15. U.S. military had to escort the Chinese back into Chinatown about a week following the attack. 45 Pacific workers were fired, but no legal action was taken against them. Though the Chinese did fight back a few times in the courts, such as Yik Wo versus Hopkins in 1886, in which the Supreme Court had ordered San Francisco to grant license for Chinese laundries to operate when they were trying to refuse to do so. In 1898, the case of the United States versus Wong Kim Ark, the Supreme Court had to state that the Chinese children that were born in the United States were considered citizens, even though that should have already been assumed, but discrimination and prejudice had bogged the minds of many. Moving along to the Irish, many Irishmen immigrated to the United States during the 1840s, mostly following the Great Famine and warfare. It had become a period of disease, hunger, and poverty in Ireland. Therefore, many decided to move to America for a better life and better chance of survival. Although the Irish were faced with discrimination as well. According to the Crayon's reflection of the census, Irishmen had childlike hearts with grotesque stupidity. Many Americans even considered them to be more like primitive cavemen instead of modern people. According to the Evils of Immigration, they took an article from an Irish newspaper about how a group of men in Ireland stormed someone's house to vote for the candidate they'd support. When the man disagreed, they attacked and killed him. Apparently, the men involved were mostly politicians. Many Americans in response stated, "What may we expect from the less intelligent and more reckless who flock to our shores by thousands?" Not only were the Irish discriminated against because of their origination, but also because of the fact that they were Catholic, which didn't sit well with many white Protestants. Many of the Irish immigrants lived in urban areas, but mostly in ethnic enclaves in New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. Most of them stayed in the urban areas because it was the easiest place to get employed. Many of them worked as low-skilled factory workers. In most Irish immigrant families, both the man and the woman worked since they received minimal pay for dangerous jobs and harsh conditions, especially since this was all occurring during the Industrial Revolution. But by the 1860s, more than half of the workers in America were Irish. Although the Irish were very much discriminated against, those who were citizens did in fact get to vote, and their discrimination was never that harsh of the Chinese discrimination. Last but not least, the Germans. Many of the Germans had moved to the United States in 1848 to avoid revolutionary warfare. Many government officials even stated that immigrants were infected by the delusions of freedom. Many of the German citizens had petitioned the Duke regarding taxes, working conditions, education, and many other issues as well. Although many of the Germans were very poor, so they entered a type of indentured servitude to get here. They had a 4 to 5 year period as indentured servants, and most of them came to the United States as family. Germans were allowed a 2-week grace period once they arrived to the colonies, so pretty much they had 2 weeks to find a family or a friend to buy out their contract. Instead of being known as indentured servants, they were actually known as German redemptioners, because they would serve easier or no work for their contracts, and they would always be bought out by friends or family. Many Germans did pursue farming since it was very profitable at the time because so many people were living in urban areas, there was good money to be made by feeding the cities. And although many Germans did become farmers, there were also quite a few who became artisans due to the fact that they were very well educated in Germany. Many Americans, in fact, did take note of the fact that so many Germans were highly educated, so they weren't discriminated against as much as many other groups. According to Joseph Kahn, who wrote Report by the German Immigrant, his journey to the United States was harder than its life there itself. He had arrived to New York, but then soon traveled to Ohio, where he became a factory worker. But due to his skill as a blacksmith in Germany, he was able to receive a better job with better pay the following year. To further support the skill and intelligence that Germans had, according to the Early German Women article, the 2 sisters had a father who received a college-level education and was a fairly successful farmer in Milwaukee. He became the first German naturalized citizens in that district. The one woman's husband was supposed to do so, but then he sadly passed away. One highly respected German immigrant was Carl Schurz. Carl Schurz had immigrated to Wisconsin in 1854. He fought in the Civil War on the Union side, became a Missouri senator, a cabinet member, a civil service reformer, and held many other high positions. He stated that the U.S. did have its defects, but that was common to all new countries. But the thing about the United States was that it offered more than any other country, including the fact that you were able to be a part of a development of a new nation. So to conclude all of this, American citizenship and rights greatly depended on what race you were. Because although the Germans did get to run in office, many of the Chinese weren't even allowed to vote, let alone go to public schools. This was mostly due to the fact that United States citizens were greatly threatened by different cultures and different people. And although the government did swoop in to help sometimes, the idea of scientific legislation was still in the back of the minds of many. Although the Supreme Court did have to step in to reinforce the fact that if someone was born on U.S. soil, they were still a citizen, many of the cases towards discrimination, the United States kept a hands-off approach of. Regardless of discrimination immigrants received, many of them still embraced America because of the abundance of opportunities, which was the true American dream for many of them. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.